Hello, happy Friday, and welcome to the third episode of the Research Reviews. Happy Friday, or whatever day you're watching this. So today we're going to be diving into creatine, and this paper is called Common Questions and Misconceptions About Creatine Supplementation. What does the scientific evidence really show? And this paper is by Antonio et al. 2021, and it's from the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. I will link the paper down below, so if you want to go read it, go have a read. It goes into way more detail on all of the points that I'm going to cover. It's quite a big paper, so I'm going to just give you a whistle-stop tour of all the common creatine myths and let you know like what is actually the sketch with these myths, where some of these myths came from. And this is a very cool paper. It's obviously a very new paper. It's a 2021 paper, and today basically brought together a load of experts in the field of creatine and creatine research in their respective fields, and combined them all together, and they've all written this paper and they've all contributed to various bits of it. So very useful little roundup. Maybe if you're a practitioner, a nutritionist, personal trainer, these are probably some of the common questions that you get from your clients. So let's get cracking. So why this paper? A roundup of literature, address some common questions and myths. And creatine is one of the most well-researched and effective supplements available, especially when it comes to a performance setting. So we know a lot about creatine. There's been a lot of research into it, and we know that it is safe and it is very effective for sporting performance. So despite this vast body of research, people still question the safety and the efficacy of it. So the effectiveness of it. So people still don't think it's effective. So we're going to clear up some of those myths for you today. So next time your clients ask you, well, I heard this about creatine, you can tell them why they're wrong. And so what questions we'll be answering? Here's the little roundup of questions that they highlighted in the paper. Does it lead to water retention? Is it a steroid? Does it cause kidney function, kidney damage? Does it cause hair loss, dehydration, muscle cramping? Is it harmful? Does it increase fat mass? Like blah, blah, blah. It goes on. Feel free to pause the video, read through those. And here we go. So does it lead to water retention? The TLDR on this is probably not. TLDR means too long didn't read. The potential mechanism of how it may cause water retention, or why people thought it would cause water retention, is because the transport of creatine into cells relies on sodium transporters. So sodium is transported into cells with creatine, which would then cause an osmotic gradient, so causing water to move into the cells. But realistically, the amount of sodium that moves into the cells with creatine is quite low. So it's really not going to change that much in terms of water movement. You might see some increases in body weight in the early stages of supplementation, and this might be due to slight changes in body water, but this generally seems to calm down. So you might see a small weight jump. It's really not a big deal. Might be some changes in body water, nothing to stress about. So next question that's frequently asked is it an anabolic steroid? And the TLDR on this is no, it's not an anabolic steroid. You'll probably notice a common theme with these TLDRs as we go through. Creatine's got a completely different chemical structure and mechanism of action to anabolic steroids. So anabolic steroids work to directly increase muscle mass, whereas creatine indirectly increases muscle mass. So creatine allows you to do things like work harder, recover faster, so you can basically train more effectively, so you can get more out of your training. Whereas anabolic steroids, even without training, you will gain muscle mass with creatine, and you will gain significant amounts of muscle mass with anabolic steroids. Whereas with creatine, you might gain a little bit of lean mass, mostly through like increase intercellular water, like small amounts of increase intercellular water, increased muscle cell volume, but it doesn't directly cause muscle growth. So creatine increases ATP resynthesis, which means improved recovery. So you can basically just train harder. Does creatine cause kidney damage and renal dysfunction? Now, this is quite a big question. This is one that gets thrown around a lot. And not in healthy people. If you are completely healthy and you don't have any underlying health conditions, you will be absolutely fine. So blood creatine levels are used as a proxy marker for kidney function, as creatine is broken down to creatinine, and then creatinine circles around in the blood, and kidneys filter creatinine. So when we have more creatine, when we take in creatine, we're obviously going to increase how much creatinine we're producing. And that is used as a marker for increased creatinine is used as a marker for kidney dysfunction. So it's not uncommon for people who are supplementing with creatine to go to their doctors and their doctors go, oh, your creatinine is a bit high. And all this means is that they're producing more creatinine, which needs to be filtered by the kidneys, which the kidneys do perfectly effectively, absolutely safely, completely fine. But it is a marker of kidney dysfunction. So it's a screening tool for kidney dysfunction. But if your kidneys are working absolutely fine, it's nothing to be worried about. So increased muscle mass, dietary creatine and creatinine intake all contribute to increased blood creatinine. So even having more muscle mass makes your blood creatinine higher. So having to filter more of this creatinine isn't necessarily a bad thing if that comes from high meat intake or creatine supplementation. If it is occurring for a different reason, that's none of those two things, like if you don't have a very high meat diet or you're not supplementing with creatine, then yes, something might be wrong. But if that's happening, then you can tell that to your doctor and see what they think, if you've been told this. So yeah, creatine is normally not present in urine, but can reach very high levels during creatine supplementation. And there appears to be an substantiated perspective that if the kidneys are forced to excrete higher than normal levels of creatine or creatinine, some kidney overload will take place. This is the whole kind of thing about people going, you'll wear out your pancreas if you eat carbohydrates. It just doesn't happen. Like, you don't wear out those cells. Causing kidney damage or renal dysfunction. In reality, transient increases in blood or urinary creatine or creatinine due to creatine supplementation are unlikely to reflect a decrease in kidney function. So basically, the urinary creatine or creatinine might go up, not a big deal if you're supplementing. Does creatine cause hair loss? And this is one that is very hotly debated. And the TLDR on this is probably not. So most of this speculation comes from a single study by, I'm going to say Murway, I don't know how that's pronounced. One study by Murway et al. That linked 25 grams of creatine for 7 days showed increased DHT. And DHT is linked to some, but not all, occurrences of baldness. So they supplemented people with creatine for 7 days and they showed increases in DHT. But this study was never replicated. So no one else has found this. So it's like, well, we don't really know why they found this, whether it's some kind of methodological error or something like that, but we're not really sure. So you might be going, what is DHT and like, why does it cause baldness? So DHT is a testosterone metabolite, which is also kind of where it's a steroid thing came from, because if it increases DHT, then like, DHT, testosterone must be steroids. So alpha-5 reductase converts free testosterone to DHT. And in males, DHT can bind to androgen receptors in susceptible hair follicles and cause those hair follicles to degrade, fall out, hence baldness. But this doesn't necessarily always happen. And also note the use of the word susceptible hair follicles. So you have to be somewhat susceptible for baldness for this to happen. So in the Murway study, they found no increase in total testosterone. Which is kind of like, if you saw that increase in the DHT, that DHT has to come from somewhere. So you'd expect that to come from the breakdown of testosterone. And they didn't measure free testosterone. I don't know why, but they didn't. And the increase in DHT stayed well within normal limits. So it doesn't look like it's going to be a problem. So further studies shown insignificant or no increase in testosterone after creatine supplementation. So everyone else that's tried to replicate this has basically shown that like it doesn't really happen. And you know what, if you are really, really worried about it and you are very concerned about it, think about it this way. You can be, if you are susceptible to baldness, you can be like bald and jacked, or you can have hair and be less jacked. Like, you get to just choose. Next thing, does creatine lead to dehydration and muscle cramp? So this is based on the rationale that creatine may alter body water distribution, as we covered in the first point. And it may increase intracellular water uptake and lead to extracellular dehydration, create electrolyte imbalance and cramp if exercising in the heat. So the self-reported data, interestingly, differs to experimental and clinical data. And we don't really know why this is, mostly because when people self-report things, they tend to report inaccurately. So it's not being like measured in a lab. And it's actually been shown to reduce cramping in clinical and performance settings. So it's one of those things of like, people will still probably go, oh, I cramped and got dehydrated because I took creatine, and the science will probably go, we don't agree, but cool, whatever. But the reality of this situation probably is that people do stupid stuff when they're kind of left to their own devices. Like, people are kind of dumb sometimes. So people will do dumb stuff. People will not take on enough water. And people will probably tell you they've taken on more water than they actually have. And in reality, if you're getting dehydrated, it's probably because you haven't taken on enough water anyway. So yeah, don't stress about it causing cramping and dehydration if you're exercising in the heat. If you are exercising in the heat, you should be taking on plenty of water anyway. So can children take creatine? And the TLDR is we are not completely sure, but probably, because we mostly can't do these studies because it's not particularly ethical. Like, if there's ethics issues involved in doing research. So giving children something when we're not 100% sure of what the outcome could be, like something that could potentially be harmful, isn't an ethical thing to do. However, some studies have shown performance benefits, but not looked at health markers in more adolescent. So like teenage athletes, those kind of people. And the FDA has classified creatine as safe. So FDA is the Food and Drink Association. And this kind of regulates all ingredients that can go into food. So this is quite a big deal, because the FDA has said, like, yeah, it's absolutely fine to be present in food and drink, which will then be consumed by like children, infants, everyone. So there's limited evidence, but it appears to be safe in a variety of performance and clinical settings. So creatine is used in the therapeutic setting, so in like hospitals and clinical settings, to help treat illness or injury, or to help in the recovery from those illnesses or injuries, for example, like spinal injuries or brain injuries. And it appears to be very safe and very effective. So does creatine increase fat mass? And the TLDR is no. Like, I don't know why this is a myth or where it came from. Some people experience a gain in body mass when they start taking creatine, probably due to the water thing. So fat-free mass appears to be increased, which explains the increases in body weight, which is like anything that's not fat basically is fat-free mass. So easy one, no, doesn't cause you to gain fat. And then, do you need a creatine loading phase? This one is quite hotly debated. And again, not necessarily. So creatine loading is defined as 5 to 7 days of 20 to 25 grams per day, followed by a maintenance dose of 3 to 5 grams per day. So you start off with like bigger doses, and this 20 to 25 grams would be split up into smaller doses over the course of the day. So you might do like 4 lots of 5 grams, or 5 lots of 4 grams, or something like that, or 5 lots of 5 grams for 7 days, 5 to 7 days, and then you come back down to just taking 1 dose of 3 to 5 grams per day. So lower doses are just as effective for increasing intramuscular creatine stores. However, it takes slightly longer to saturate these creatine stores. So it takes slightly longer to get to, you're trying to get to here. So if you load, you can go like pretty much straight like that. Whereas if you are gonna just start taking 3 to 5 grams a day, it's probably going to be like a slightly shallower trajectory. It's probably going to take a little bit longer to hit this point. So if you hit this point in 5 days with loading, it might take like 28 days without loading. So saturation just occurs more rapidly with the loading phase. So if you like are not particularly first, like you're just an average person, like normal gym goer, maybe you've taken like you tried loading creatine before and didn't, like had some kind of stomach cramps or something, or just didn't get on with it, or just couldn't be bothered, because that's a legit reason not to. Just start taking 5 grams a day. Not a big deal. So is creatine good for older adults? Probably. Like, this is positive news. This is great. And it can help to attenuate age-related sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is kind of muscle loss as you get older, which can lead to an increased risk of falls. So by reducing sarcopenia, maintaining muscle mass for longer, we can reduce the risk of falls, we can increase functionality, we can give people a better quality of life as they age and make them more mobile for longer, so fewer disability-adjusted life years, and they're self-sufficient for longer, which is amazing. Everyone wants that for their elderly relatives. And then it seems to be best used in conjunction with some resistance training. So get your grandma on creatine, might do her some good. Then is creatine good for anything other than resistance exercise? Probably. Again, like, great news. Carbohydrates and protein promote greater protein. What am I on about? So carbohydrates plus creatine. I don't know why I've written protein. So if you take carbohydrates on, it increases muscle glycogen storage. If you take on carbohydrates with creatine, it seems to promote greater muscle glycogen storage than carbohydrates alone, which can be great for like a carbohydrate loading strategy for an endurance athlete. Might reduce muscle damage and enhance recovery. So again, like for anyone who trains a lot, regardless of what sport it is, something that you want to be doing is maximizing your recovery. And there's evidence showing that there are fewer musculoskeletal injuries and reduced injury recovery time in athletes that are taking creatine from kind of all sports. I think this one was in team sports, they looked at that. And it can aid hyperhydration, so reduce the likelihood of heat-related injuries. So if you're going to be doing a race or a game or a training camp in the heat, it can help you to hyperhydrate, so almost like overhydrate, so that as you lose that water through sweating because it's hot, you're less likely to become dehydrated because you had a higher start point. And it's potentially neuroprotective, which is great for collision sports, so things like rugby, American football, anything where there is a chance that you might get a concussion or that you might get a smack in the head. It can be neuroprotective, so it can help to reduce damage associated with things like that. And another one, is creatine only effective in males? No, very effective in females. Females generally have higher intramuscular creatine levels, but lower creatine in the brain. So those higher intramuscular creatine levels might explain why sometimes creatine is shown to be less effective, has less of an ergogenic effect in women than it does in men, because like the difference between women and men is different. So you may see reduced ergogenic effect, but you might see things like improvements in depressive symptoms. So supplementing with creatine might help out with things like mood. But then hormonal changes through the menstrual cycle and lifetime can influence creatine kinetics, bioavailability, so it is very changeable. So you won't always have a consistent level of creatine floating around. It can also be that, so there hasn't been much in the way of study done in pregnant women, but there is some very promising animal data showing that taking creatine during pregnancy can help to reduce the risk of like preterm birth or low birth weight or things like that, and just generally keeping babies healthy. So should you take it as the monohydrate form? I think this is the last point. Or should you take it as some other form? And the TLDR is stick with monohydrate. Some other forms of creatine have been proposed as superior. If you've heard any of these, you've probably heard of like creatine ethyl ester. And while some of them are more soluble in water, they're not as effective. So the research we currently have suggests that this isn't true, that they're more effective. They're not superior. They don't have the same beneficial like ergogenic effects as just plain old creatine monohydrate. So creatine isn't stable and it will degrade once you mix it with water. So you have to mix it with water and then take it straight away. You don't want to be hanging around with that. But yeah, like stick with creatine monohydrate. It's the cheapest form. It's the most bioavailable form. Don't bother with any of these fancy forms. Like they're probably, I think one of the claims of creatine ethyl ester was that it doesn't cause water retention. It's like, yeah, that's kind of like, or that it doesn't cause any increases in body weight when you first start taking it. It's like, well, that's worrying because that's kind of like the whole point of creatine. So if it doesn't cause any increases in body weight, then it's probably not getting to the target tissues. So take from that what you will. And then the take home points, don't stress about water retention. It's just probably going to be like, it probably isn't permanent. And sometimes you see slight increases and it tends to just drop off. Creatine is probably very helpful for most athletes. Weight sensitive sports might be an exception just because of like the water retention issue. So don't start taking it like a week out from your weigh-in for whatever sport you do. And creatine is generally great for most populations, but do check with your doctor if you think there might be any underlying health concerns. If you do have any like kidney issues or have had any previous kidney issues or have a family history of kidney issues, do check with your doctor before you start taking it. And I'm going to leave that one there. Thank you very much, and I will see you next week.